The story of AIDS in the United States has been told in many forms, including through quilts. Deborah E. Freedman of Portland is the author of a book called The Quiet Triumph of the Heart, Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt Stories from Maine. She's with us here on 207, and we should mention, first of all, that we have a quilt that's right here. What's the story behind this, Deborah?
This is a quilt that has all Maine panels. There are 8 panels that make up a quilt, and one of the earliest quilt that was made in Maine.
How did the quilt making in connection with AIDS get started?
Cleve Jones out in San Francisco went down a street and said, "Everybody I know here is gone. People were dying so fast." And he was in a parade and asked people to write a name on a piece of cardboard. And after the parade was over, it was put on a brick wall, and it made him think of a quilt.
It was a way to pay tribute to people who had died of AIDS, a way to remember people who had died of AIDS, a way to bring public attention to the disease at the time. And this was back in the 80s that the quilt making got started, when a lot of people didn't understand AIDS, were terrified of AIDS, and so forth, right?
Yeah, and this was back in probably 87-ish that it all began. And then the next year, it was a gay lesbian pride parade, and so they had a network all over the United States. And so he requested Quilt, what he then called Quilt, to come and be part of the parade. And the story goes that the post office called him and said, "We have some quilt panels for you. Bring a truck."
This book, The Quiet Triumph of the Heart, consists of sort of 3 things, you say. Stories about the quilt, or stories from the quilt, stories of things that you just encountered, stories that you came upon as you were out walking the streets of Portland, and then fairy tales that you made up. How about the stories that you just sort of encountered? How do they fit into this work?
Well, because I helped people make their panels, so I got the stories. I got the stories of the person who died, the family and friends who stayed with them and made the panel. And then when I traveled with the quilt, telling these stories, I got stories back. So I had 3 levels of stories happening at the same time.
In terms of the quilt, this quilt is in Maine permanently?
We have a chapter in Ogunquit, and they keep quilt there year-round. So anybody, they have 20 of these quilts.
Same size, and this is obviously big. It's what, 12 feet across and 12 feet tall, is that right?
It is.
And so there are 20 that are this size?
In Ogunquit at all times. And they will be displayed Memorial Day weekend.
There have been enormous strides in the treatment of AIDS. The medication has made a quantum leap from where it was in the 1980s, so that AIDS is now a very survivable disease. How do the quilts still speak to people?
People are still grieving. It's a heart thing. The quilt is about the heart, overrides the mind. And so the empathy that the quilt displays reaches anybody who has lost somebody, who has experienced a death of it, for any disease. But particularly AIDS, because it was so hidden for so long.